This is lesson 4, evolution. In this lesson, we will be looking at the science and engineering practices of asking questions and defining problems, constructing explanations and designing solutions, engaging in an argument from evidence, and obtaining, evaluating, and communicating information. Our cross-cutting concepts are patterns, cause and effect, and stability and change. So understanding evolution. Evolution is the change in the characteristics of a population over time. It's important to recognize that we're talking about populations of organisms and not necessarily individual organisms when talking about evolution. Evolution is the change in the characteristics of a population over time, meaning that evolution affects the characteristics of living things. A characteristic is any feature of an organism. It includes both physical and behavioral characteristics. Physical characteristics are things like feathers or fur, those physical attributes that an organism has. Behavioral characteristics are those specific things that an organism does or how it behaves. Does it call to other organisms? Does it live in large schools as a behavior? Does this particular organism hibernate during specific times of the year? What reactions does this organism have to the environment in which it lives in? Evolution is the change in the characteristics of a population over time. So this means that evolution causes the characteristics of organisms to change. For example, fur color changing from brown to black over a long period of time. Evolutionary change does not happen over the lifetime of an individual organism, but over different generations. And that is extremely important for us to recognize. It's not about the individual, it's about the changes that occur from generation to generation to generation. Evolution is the change in the characteristics of a population over time. This means that evolution affects populations. So what is a population? A population is all of the members of a particular species living in one area. Evolution is the change in the characteristics of a population over time. This means that evolution takes place over long periods of time. Sometimes we observe changes over short periods of time, but oftentimes it's many thousands of years where we see those changes, and we only can identify them through long periods of records from other individuals that have documented these organisms or from the fossil record. So over long periods of time, evolution will cause the characteristics of a particular population to change. So change in monkeys. Imagine that a scientist records the characteristics of a population of one species of monkey. If the scientist could repeat the investigation several thousand years later, the characteristics of the population may have changed slightly. This may be physical or behavioral changes. Physical changes that may occur include things like fur color over long periods of time. Tail length may be a change that we exhibit in this population of monkeys over long periods of time, or even behavioral changes. For example, this species' reaction to danger. So how long does evolution take? Evolutionary change occurs over many generations in a population. This means that evolutionary change may occur slowly over thousands of years. We do have examples of single cellular organisms that have fast reproductive rates and can give many generations very quickly, where change does occur over these shorter periods of time. So some single-celled organisms evolve quickly over timescales that can be observed in a laboratory. So how does evolution happen? Recall that evolution occurs through a process called natural selection, and that was first proposed by the naturalist Charles Darwin in the 1800s. It is often referred to as Darwin's theory of evolution. Natural selection explains how species change over time as a result of differences in the characteristics and survival rates of individuals. There are 4 key features of populations that allow natural selection to take place. The first one is the potential for a species to increase in number. That is, those organisms that are reproducing oftentimes reproduce many offspring over their lifetime. There may be many breeding individuals in a population, or there may be few producing lots of offspring. This means that the size of each population has the potential to increase over time. The second key features of populations which allow natural selection to take place is that there has to be heritable genetic variation of individuals in a species due to mutation and sexual reproduction. Some characteristics can be passed on from parents to offspring. These are the things that are inheritable. These are inherited characteristics that oftentimes come through sexual reproduction to the offspring. Heritable characteristics are controlled by genes. When an organism reproduces, some of its genes are passed on to the next generation. These genes can then be expressed as characteristics in the new organism. Sometimes mutations take place in the transference of genes from one generation to the next. These mutations lead to slight variations within the offspring. Genetic variation is also a key component to this. If we were to look at our classmates, we would notice that all of us have variation. Some of the things that we are variable in are things like height, skin, and hair color. Maybe some of you can roll your tongue a single time, or maybe even a double tongue roll. Your foot size. And so it's really important to recognize we all have variations. Not all observable characteristics can be inherited, however. Some are a result of an individual's interaction with the environment. So there is variation present in the genetic information present in every population. This means that a range of heritable characteristics exists in every population. Mutations. Variation is also caused by mutations, which are changes in DNA. Sometimes mutations change the properties of a gene, causing it to be expressed slightly differently. So for example, a mutation in a flower gene could cause the coloration of that flower to be slightly different. Maybe a change from a purple expression to a white expression of the flower. Or maybe some color in between, like a pink color. Sexual reproduction plays into the new generation having variation also. This is because each new organism receives a random assortment of genes from its two parents. You only get half of the genetic information from your mom and half from your dad, meaning that some of your dad's genetic information is left out and some of your mom's genetic information is left out, and only half of that genetic information from each parent goes to create the full genetic information that is you. This leads to variation. So this causes offspring to have different characteristics to their parents and to each other, even though we still exhibit some characteristics of each parent often. There are slight variations that exist within you and me comparative to our parents. The third key feature is competition. Specifically, when we're talking about competition, we're talking about what is occurring when there are limited resources. So some resources needed by organisms are limited. They are shared between members of a population. This means that organisms compete with each other for access to these resources. And there may not be enough of those resources for everyone in the environment. The fourth key feature is the proliferation of those organisms that are better able to survive and reproduce in an environment. Some organisms based on variation are simply better at outcompeting others for limited resources. The success of an organism depends on its characteristics. Organisms with characteristics that are better suited to their environments are more likely to survive, and then if they are more likely to survive, they are more likely to reproduce and pass those characteristics on that allowed them to survive to the next generation. So that is, the successful genes are oftentimes passed to the offspring of the parents. So what is the effect of natural selection? Over time, natural selection increases the proportion of individuals in a population with characteristics that allow them to be more successful in their environment. If those characteristics remain successful, then over many generations, all individuals in the population will eventually carry those characteristics, or at least the vast majority of them will. This causes populations to evolve over time. So let's look at this with an example. Specifically, let's look at natural selection and how it might choose for a specific trait in a population of rabbits. Darwin's theory of natural selection is based on the fact that variation among organisms causes them to differ in their ability to survive and reproduce. So in a population of rabbits, there is variation in fur color. Some of those rabbits are white in color, and some of them are brown in color. That's variation. All of the rabbits have to compete for limited resources, such as food and who they get to reproduce with, and they also are competing to avoid predators. So in a snowy environment, rabbits with white fur are better camouflaged. Brown rabbits stick out. And so therefore the white-furred rabbits are more adapted and better suited to the white environment. The brown rabbits are more likely to be seen and caught by predators. White rabbits are more likely to survive than the brown rabbits and therefore are more likely to reproduce. That's the important part. If you survive because you are better fit to the environment, you are then more likely to pass the characteristics that you have on to the next generation. As a result, the genes for white fur are more likely to be passed on to the next generation than the genes for brown fur. So if the environment stays the same, in that we have a white background, lots of snow, the number of white rabbits in the population will gradually increase, while the number of brown rabbits decreases. So what do you think would happen if we didn't have a white background? What would happen if global warming caused the majority of snow to melt and there was minimal periods of the year where snow existed on the ground? It might be important for the population to retain some of the genes for the brown fur. If it didn't retain some of those genes, we may end up with a lot of white rabbits with a brown background. All right, so looking at the order of stages in natural selection. Number 1, genetic variation exists between individuals of a population. Number 2, individuals compete with each other for food, water, and mates, and also to avoid predators. Number 3, individuals with adaptive phenotypes are the physical traits that are expressed by organisms, compete better and are more likely to survive and reproduce at the expense of individuals with less adaptive phenotypes, again, physical traits, and fewer competitive characteristics, which die or reproduce less. That's stage 4. Stage 5, genes for adaptive characteristics are more likely to be inherited, and the number of individuals with the adaptive phenotypes, again, phenotypes of physical characteristic, they increase. So looking at an example, how the giraffe got its neck. How does natural selection help to explain the long neck of a giraffe? There's variation within the population. And due to this variation, the ancestors of modern giraffes would have had long necks or short necks. They would have had different lengths. Giraffes with longer necks would have been able to reach food that was higher than those with shorter necks. And so as a result, the long-necked giraffes were more likely to survive and produce offspring in greater numbers, thereby slowly eliminating the short-necked giraffes from the population. So let's look at natural selection in action. The common tree snake is a native of Australia and feeds mainly on frogs and geckos. Over the past few decades, the snake has evolved to reproduce and specifically, as reproduction is taking place, the organisms have reduced head size. In 1937, the cane toad was introduced to Australia, where it has become a major pest. This toad is highly toxic, and its large size ensures that any predators eating the entire animal receives a huge dose of poison. Initially, the common tree snake fed upon the cane toads they had not encountered, and so they thought it was okay for them to eat those toads, and they had no resistance to the poison. Most snakes that fed upon cane toads quickly died. This exerted a strong selection pressure on the snake population. Selection favored any snakes that could avoid eating the cane toads. As snakes eat their food whole, a small head prevents them from feeding on large prey. So, for example, the cane toad. So a small head has a selective advantage, allowing snakes to easily avoid cane toad poisoning, especially those larger toads with greater amounts of poison. So small-headed snakes had a greater advantage of surviving and reproducing. The average head size of the population shrank as more small-headed snakes survived to pass on their genes. This is a specific example where it was measured that this population of snakes changed over time. Speciation over time. Over time, natural selection may cause a population to become so different that it becomes a new species. This process is called speciation. Over millions of years, natural selection and speciation have produced a huge variety of life that we see on Earth today. Over 1.5 million species have been documented on Earth thus far, and many more are yet to be discovered. When talking about the theory of evolution, we talk about this idea of common ancestors. Chimpanzees are very closely related to other ape species, specifically the bonobo. Both ape species live in Central Africa. Here's a picture of a chimpanzee, and here's the bonobo. What similarities or differences do we notice? Both of these species are very similar in appearance and size. Compared to chimpanzees, bonobos have darker faces and are more slender with longer limbs. They also have different behavioral characteristics. They are less aggressive than chimpanzees and oftentimes form female-led social groups compared to the male-led groups of chimpanzees. Around 1.5 to 2 million years ago, a speciation event occurred that separated a population of apes. The population north of the Congo River evolved to become chimpanzees, and the population south of the river evolved to become bonobos. So what may have caused this speciation event? The thought is that the current course of the Congo River changed during this period of time, separating the two populations of organisms. An ancestor is a species that another species evolved from at some point in its evolutionary past. A common ancestor is an ancestor shared by more than one species. The common ancestor of chimpanzees and bonobos is the species of ape that lived 1.5 to 2 million years ago when the speciation event occurred. So what characteristics do you think this ancestor had of chimpanzees and bonobos? Probably characteristics that are exhibited in both populations of organisms. And the bonobos inherited specific characteristics that are specific to them, and the chimpanzees inherited specific characteristics that are specific to them. A universal common ancestor. According to the theory of evolution, all organisms would have had to have arisen from a common ancestor. Any two species that share a common ancestor at some point in their evolutionary past would have a common ancestor. The more distantly related the species are, the further back in time their common ancestor existed. All species alive today evolved from a universal common ancestor early in the history of life on Earth. So looking back through time, simple life forms first developed on Earth over 3.5 billion years ago, according to this theory. This image shows stromatolites. They are mounds made of microorganisms. Stromatolites are some of the Earth's earliest life forms, with fossils aged at over 3 billion years. All life on Earth has evolved from the first living organisms through the process of natural selection over time. According to the theory of evolution, stromatolites would have been some of the earliest life forms, and everything would have evolved from them. Stromatolites are mounds made of layered microorganisms, especially cyanobacteria, which are photosynthetic. They are common in the fossil record of the Precambrian, and they still exist on Earth today, although they are much more rare. Extinction also plays into this theory. Most of the species that have lived on Earth are extinct today. This is because environmental conditions on Earth have changed many times over the history of Earth. This causes natural selection to favor different characteristics. Species that cannot adapt to environmental changes become extinct. It is thought that over 99% of species that have ever lived on Earth are to be extinct. So in summary, let's explore this. What are the missing words that we have in here about our theory of evolution? Simple life forms first appeared on Earth over 3 billion years ago. Individuals in a population of a species show differences in the characteristics. This is called variation. Our differences in a population is variation. Natural selection enables individuals with characteristics most suited to their environment to survive and reproduce. Blank for useful characteristics are more likely to be passed on to the next generation. Definitely genes for useful characteristics. As a result, the percentage of individuals with these characteristics gradually increases. New species evolve from existing species from different genes or when different genes are selected for in two populations.